And hello, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives. And it's Thursday evening, the 18th of May, 2023. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Nick back to the show. Nick Petosky, also known as Nick from Twitter. And I'm looking forward to getting into some of the early AIDS investigations and talk about some of the important people involved in that and what we can learn from that for our interesting situation today. So, without further ado, welcome, Nick.
Hi, John, and hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us on this early summer evening.
Yeah, it's great to have you back. And well, as we talked about earlier today, what I thought would be good because I have. Nowhere near the comprehensive view of this field that you have. I, of course, had studied Dr. Leonard Horowitz and his book, Emerging Viruses, and the uh, literature surrounding that, the Special Virus Cancer Program. And you and I have done a couple of shows now in which a number of things that have been put together recently have been presented that should alert everybody that the people back then, some of them really knew what was going on and followed their instincts as opposed to obedience to higher authorities to figure out what the heck was AIDS really about. And the community, of course, that it hit the worst is the gay community. So, Nick, Alan Cantwell, a person I'd never heard of until a month or so ago, and then I was fortunate enough to see you posting on Twitter a copy of the last interview conducted with him and Dr. Lynn Horowitz. And I was just totally touched by it. I thought these guys are not only are they sincere, but they are able to relate what they the knowledge that they have in a very understandable and calm way. And it's just shocking that their insights weren't accepted, back in the day. But that's the way it is. So let me turn it over to you, if you would, to introduce people to Dr. Alan Cantwell and the atmosphere and the scene that surrounds the discoveries that he was making.
Absolutely. I had the great pleasure of meeting Dr. Cantwell in 2019, and he has since passed on. He passed on just a few days before his birthday in January of 2021. And Alan was a lifelong devotee to public health and to research, not just as a practicing clinician, but as someone who took his spare time to continue in other dimensions, on other levels beyond what his specialty was. Ended up at UCLA in the 1970s working in dermatology. So to set the table, for everyone, this is a kid from the East Coast. He went to Korea. He was a medic and helped run an STD clinic as part of his service overseas. He tells some funny stories. To me, I'm not going to repeat the lurid details, but he does make reference to it in his video about the folks surrounding his camp, just waiting for people to get done with their treatment, at the STD clinic. Lots of fun stuff that he relays about that era. But he tells in his book, The Cancer Microbe, which is really for him, it's kind of an ode to a number of scientists, different eras of science, different directions of investigations that he amalgamates together. But he talks about this this era of cancer research and of the things that were going on at the time, starting from the 50s all the way up until the emergence of HIV, in quite a critical light. He he really takes a critical eye to are we going after root cause? Are we trying to cure disease and ease suffering? Are we trying to remove disease from the body and reestablish homeostasis? Or are we chasing after people with the latest product that we can make a commission on. So those are some of the things that he, took to heart in his writing. But he's really an amazing scientist who, as I said, is really centered in dermatology. But then through his extracurricular effort, his assertions in additional research, he comes into the tutelage of Dr. Virginia Livingston, an excellent, amazing scientist in and of her own right, cancer researcher from the 1950s who ended up being really his senior mentor in that area. And the reason that he had such a crossover to cancer in particular is because as a dermatologist, people come to see you because there's a problem on the skin. And as we know, skin cancers, are a common thing that you might see a dermatologist for. So those are some opening thoughts about sort of who Alan was as a professional and a little bit about his life. Where do you think we should go from here?
Well, I did have a question about the skin cancer itself. It's has it not been dramatically increasing during our lifetimes, or is that beyond what you've been studying? Because I'm thinking to be a dermatologist, 50 years ago, uh, would be right at the cusp of when we started seeing a lot more skin cancers, and people were all, I mean, a lot of people I know that would just say, "Oh, I had a skin cancer. They took it off. It's no big deal." But is the incidence of skin cancer probably since World War II? It seems to me it's higher, but of course I'm no expert.
That's definitely what the literature indicates, John, that those are the signals that skin cancer, along with everything across the board, all varieties of cancers, really have changed the landscape of how many cancers per million people there are in the different categories has dramatically increased. And I could speculate, as to my own thoughts about skin cancer as to why. But really, I don't want to take away from either of Alan's works, which are a little less known than his investigative pieces more about HIV/AIDS that came out in the 1980s. He has two pieces that he wrote. One is The Cancer Microbe, and the other is For Women Against Cancer. And one of the things that I'll say that really, if anybody listening tonight, is familiar with Alan's work or his practice or was a friend of Alan's, something that I took away as a very, very junior investigator compared to this man when I finally met him, was how selfless he is. Or was, and how he was constantly, paying homage to the investigators and the discoveries that came before him. He definitely was in that way a very unusual scientist, because a lot of what we see in science, and I don't want to make a blanket judgment here about the behavior of scientists. That's not what we're doing. But we do see in science the emergence of ego, as we see it in commerce and in industry and business and certainly in media. There's a lot of people that pursue what they think of as excellence because it's really they just want more of themselves and they're wrapped around themselves. Alan, as a clinician, as a curious scientist, as a little kid, his dad was encouraging him to become a doctor. Please become a doctor, and he never describes it in uh, an intimidating way, in an oppressive way. Really, it was something he really felt drawn to a number of different disciplines, but he gravitated finally to science and to clinical science so that he could help people. And he was also very much someone who asked questions. He questioned conventions. So I take that away from him as well: is don't be afraid to take something that you encounter in your medical framework. Most of us are living in the Western allopathic framework of a set of symptoms that map very quickly in a doctor's encounter to a diagnosis, which pairs to a series of potential treatments, things that can be prescribed. And I would say become more like Alan, and question, what is the toxicity of that treatment? What are the options that I could consider? Is there an underlying situation that we're ignoring by throwing something like an anti-inflammatory or an analgesic at this problem? How do we get to the root of the problem? That's, for me, probably the most moving piece that I took away from my friendship with him, and studying, what not a malcontent, but a scofflaw. He wouldn't say balderdash about everything. He lived and survived his entire career as a dermatologist at Kaiser. You can't do that and be, a Wild West mad scientist. But certainly in his writing, he goes back to suppressed cancer treatments, things that he thinks really merit further investigation, things that he feels, or evidence, through his work, that were swept under the rug by the AMA because they upset a financial model, an apple cart of treatment and surgery and irradiation that was decided upon by Rockefeller medicine decades ago, that's how we need to deal with things like cancer. So he was a fantastic rebel. And definitely as an allopath, as a practicing allopath, he was a practitioner of integrated medicine, of functional medicine, truly.
So, as far as cancer is concerned, I do know one thing that he has said, and that is that he believes that cancer comes from a something alive. Why can't I call the word? You know what I'm trying to say.
A microbe,
A
yes, yes.
microbe. Thank you. Yeah, and has that idea gotten any traction? And I can't help but reflect upon the recent, a year or so ago, Brian Artis, the chiropractor, and Tal Brown talking about snake venom and things like that. In other words, the idea of a cancer coming from some little bitty thing that you can't see struck Dr. Cantwell as kind of unusual, and more likely that it would have been a microbe. Isn't that one of his big theories?
He is quite prostrate to Dr. Livingston, and definitely, says, look at her work. She was writing about the complexity of cancer. That's really what we need to take away, instead of trying to chase after what do we need to fire the silver bullet at. When it comes to the cancer question, we need to accept that it's a rich and complex situation in the body. It can be influenced by chemical toxicities. Like we've talked a little bit about glyphosate, and it has a function, it makes functional changes in our cells' ability to deal with and recognize and manage cancer, because we're constantly checking cancer in our bodies. We have mechanisms to identify and signal and collapse a cell that is starting to malfunction. And what we see in the complex situation where cancer presents as a disorder, an imbalance, can be from a toxicity, it can be from a microbe, a variety of microbes, as it appears to have been demonstrated in the literature of the Special Virus Cancer Program and other places, as well as now this layer of biological complexity that Cantwell and Livingston are emphasizing. And they are saying that certain forms of bacilli, as well as mycoplasma, likely play an active role in a number of different types of cancers, leukemias, lymphomas, and sarcomas. So it isn't just cells stop working, cancer starts growing. There's a great number of paths that can trick the body into letting its guard down. The current concern in the COVID era is either through an injection or through infection. What is the mechanic of the spike protein involving the P53 cancer protein, our cancer gene that protects us. It's the main guard at the gate of the city that keeps cancer at bay. And there's indicators that P53 is down regulated as a result of encountering COVID. So that's one more piece of complexity to this that we should take away. The good news is, I know it sounds like I'm describing there's hordes, coming at us, coming at our bodies to get us, and that's the bleak outlook of cancer. Is that our bodies are amazing and resilient and continue to learn about how to defend us, as long as we keep certain channels in our bodies clear. We attend to the toxicity levels that we're inevitably going to pick up. We're going to get this stuff in our bodies. We live on planet Earth. There's certain molecules that we're going to encounter: microplastics, glyphosate, PFASs, all kinds of things. There's a list of things that we can then, when I say attend to it, I mean we practice things in diet and in supplementation, and maybe in a therapy, in a clinical, like an IV therapy that you would do with a practitioner, to chelate things out of the body, to bring the ball back towards your side, get it away from the goal line, and keep cancer at bay. Give your body, bring back the natural, healthy capability to keep all of those nasty processes at bay.
Sounds like a great plan, and I would love to see that implemented. The um, topic we wanted to talk about, I guess, with Alan Cantwell, and
Mhm.
intrigues me is uh, how does he react when AIDS first hits the scene, and how does he develop his hypothesis as to what's going on?
Well, as you might have in many instances in your career learned about something quite impressive, quite shocking from the front line by being involved in a case, right?
Hmm.
Alan learned about AIDS by patients walking into his office. So here's a younger dermatologist come over from the East Coast, has a practice now at UCLA at Kaiser, and he begins accepting these first referrals of Kaposi sarcoma patients, young gay men from the community in their 20s and 30s, who are suddenly being overtaken by this aggressive skin cancer with quite a everybody from the era remembers what the images in the press were of someone who was suffering from KS. So that's how he really came to terms with what is HIV/AIDS. He was a frontline clinician. He would then have a lot of back and forth in dealings between oncologists and pathologists, because as you probably know, the pathologist checks everybody's math. The pathologist is the actuarial of what happens under the microscope, really, when it comes to determining what was that thing, what was in that biopsy or in that sample. So he continued, that those relationships. He describes them in his writing. But quite frankly, as far as the whistleblower topic and really coming into any serious evidence that something was really wrong, and causing him to question how did HIV really come to be in public health, that didn't happen until I think about 84 or 85. That's when he was invited over to Dr. Livingston's house. She said, "You've got to come over and meet this gastroenterologist. He's also a pathologist and a doctor of internal medicine. He had four specialties, Dr. Strecker." And she said, "Robert's going to talk to us about, his theories. He's got a whole lot of handouts for us, and it's going to probably take a couple hours. So come on over." And that's when Alan was first introduced to these concepts about biowarfare, about a technology called recombinant DNA technology, which was really the wellspring, the predecessor of what we call gain of function today, and began hearing about all this information.
The gain of function. When back in '84, you would hear of that?
No, it was called recombinant DNA technology at the time.
Okay.
It went out of the special virus cancer program. That's really where it crystallized, where most of the people who were practicing it, it was a standard of practice, that they had, standardized procedures to cross pathogens, to attenuate or damage pathogens, and then get them to recombine, to reconnect into hybrids and chimeras. That was early gain of function. They didn't call it gain of function. They called it recombinant DNA technology. And at the end of the special virus cancer program in 1978, they didn't shut that biowarfare stuff down. They gave them a department and gave them laboratories at the NIH. All of the weird, spooky Island of Dr. Moreau stuff that they cooked up for 17 years in the SVCP found a home. Nothing was wasted. That's a very important part for the historians or people that are trying to trace when did all of this stuff happen and when did it start. Well, they let very wild and dangerous and aggressive biowarfare projects come into a doghouse called the SVCP, and up front they painted a little sign that said the war on cancer, but nobody really understood or had any insight into everything that was going on in the program. So that's where there is just a name change, a development, an evolution of the language from its original to the current state. And right now it feels like they're trying to redefine gain of function. They're trying to erase that out of people's minds and memory hole that by introducing new disciplines, new labels for what they do when they increase the fitness of a pathogen or move a pathogen from one animal into human beings.
I remember in the '80s, I was practicing law, and although I didn't, it wasn't inherent to my practice. I did some wills now and then, and one of my clients had uh, a friend that was suffering from that sarcoma, Karposky's sarcoma. Did I say it right? And so I went to
Kaposi sarcoma.
Right, and so I went to visit him in the hospital and did a last will for him, and I remember I'll never forget seeing him, and it was just that his skin was just covered with blue blotches everywhere, and uh, it was pretty shocking and frightening. That was kind of indicative of AIDS at the time. However, you don't see that so much anymore. Has that been resolved, the Karpowski sarcoma problem?
So this is an important piece if we're going to talk. Well, we're talking about Alan Cantwell and what he was, really how he was drawn into HIV/AIDS. Why, as a clinician, was he involved in it? What was his background? I think we've kind of established that. Now on to the causes. This is for me an area where I very much would appreciate an audience with RFK Jr. to just help clarify precisely um, the clinical and evidentiary basis of where does KS come from. KS is a communicable manifestation of one of the multiple herpes viruses, John. And right now, I'm trying to get my head around an analysis of perhaps how many of the herpes viruses actually came directly out of the same era of sloppy primate science being used to create human biologicals. But coming back to KS, it's got two names in the technical sense. One is KSHV, Kaposi's sarcoma herpes virus. And at the time that, you've probably seen again and again from the era literature that we've only ever seen this before in elderly Mediterranean men. Yes, it was generally observed up until that point because it had been observed and characterized for 100 years before it suddenly manifests in these communities in the United States. It also manifests in Africa, and it's also, unfortunately, looks like that there is a simian analog to this. But KSHV has another name, and that's now uh, uh, HSV8. So that's human herpes virus H, HHV8. Sorry. So both of these names are the same, describe the same variant. And that variant is one of many in a cluster of the human herpes virus family. And it gets into the body through mucosa. So kissing, I believe it can be transmitted through transfusion. But anything where there's fluid exchange or sexual contact, there's going to be a risk for exchange of this type of herpes virus, as there is for a number of other types of pathogens. It doesn't have a direct observable initial syndrome, where, as you might see in herpes type 1, HSV1, the classic blisters around the mouth or on the lips, or blisters on the genitals for herpes type 2, both of which can be infected on either site. It's really about mucosal access. But HSV8 doesn't have a calling card. You don't know that you've got it. You don't feel something like mononucleosis. That's the syndrome you feel. You just feel knocked out when you get Epstein-Barr virus. Generally, you have a general viremia. You have a syndrome where you feel, really like you've had the flu for about a week or two. But HHV8 just comes in very silently, and unfortunately, it continues to spread. There's no, at this point, because it's a very uncommon test, you don't generally go to a city or a county STD clinic and get an HHV8 test. They would have to send it generally to another lab. And they would say, why do you need to have this? You would literally have to be presenting disease to get a confirmatory test from a clinic like that. Through your doctor or through anyone, you can just ask for it. You can say, I want to screen for the full spectrum of herpes viruses that are potentially involved with cancer. This is one of them. But this is the point that I would like to clarify with RFK Jr. is he cites Peter Duesberg a lot. And we've talked a little about Dr. Duesberg and his thoughts on Kaposi sarcoma having something to do with the use of this chemical inhalant, these poppers, which give you a very, very much just a very quick high, a head rush kind of high. And there's been some papers about the health effects of using poppers, and I'm certainly not here, to endorse them. But I did want to disambiguate that there is a clear biological, communicable, and long established etiology to where does KS come from, and it's from this herpes virus. There may be other things that might interact with causing the presentation of KS later on in life. What I know most of all is through the lens of what Dr. Cantwell saw, what he put in his papers, what was happening with the immune systems of the patients that he saw, because he was able to see their blood work as well. And they were clearly in a state of immune collapse. So that's really where this quiet herpes virus turns into a danger, is when you suddenly do have a drop for whatever reason in your immune system.
It sounds like he was involved in discovering those connections that you just spoke of. Did he start to recognize the fact that this might be a biological weapons program, or in not necessarily the KS, but the idea of using this recombinant DNA technology to do bad things as opposed to just science?
No, that's one of the things that was important for me to get closer to clinicians, because I think a lot of us put things on the clinical doctor that we shouldn't. Some of us will go into a clinical encounter and, with a handful of white papers and say, how come you haven't tested me for this? We expect our general practitioners, our general MDs, to have the entire universe of current verified science in their head, or easy to access on the computer, and also be up to speed on all of the cutting edge discussions, investigations, and experiments. So that's where I was glad to hear him just sort of the things that dawned on him, the massive areas of science, which he still, when I met him in 2019, he would say, I'm not a virologist. I can't talk about the details. I'm like, Alan, I'm not a virologist either, but we can both look at this language, which was written for the program leadership. It wasn't written in an exceedingly technical voice. It's written in an administrative voice, in a summary voice, so that people that aren't necessarily clinical or technical lab researchers can approach it. They can understand it, and we would look at things together. But he would still push himself back from that. He made speculations about, why cancer. I think the most important sort of revolutionary proclamation he made, besides that HIV appeared to be a bioweapon, was that the suppression of cancer treatments and cancer technologies was another major crime that goes back to my point about not upsetting the powers that be. So he followed on to Strecker. Now I don't have the pleasure of having one of those stacks of many papers and artifacts that Dr. Strecker used to hand out at these conversations, these fireside chats. Alan got one. Dr. Livingston got one, and Alan included a number of the original artifacts in his archive, which I was able to digitize at USC. And anything that wasn't from the mainstream press, anything that might have been difficult to find, or perhaps a unique artifact that he gave me permission to, I digitized it. And I've been replicating that stuff out with other scientists. I've been sharing it and sharing it and sharing it. So it's nothing that you have to buy from me, or you've got to log in or join a club or subscribe anywhere. It's part of the larger living Zatiro library that I circulate regularly. So that's where Alan's work went. But to come back to your point, no, he really came in very much the same way that I did, as a skeptic, John, and said, this can't be. When he heard this stuff from Dr. Strecker, he was like, this is just too much. This is over the top.
Well,
And he started looking.
What is it that Strucker said that he was reacting to?
Oh, that HIV had been a long-term planned bioweapon, and that
Okay.
there was a great deal of material in the scientific literature across a number of journals and institutions, like the National Academy of Sciences had a great number of papers that were quite germane, and a number of universities around the world that had part of this money to research the recombination of viruses, which inevitably it sounded to some folks like they were actually engineering new viruses. No, the easiest thing for them to do was to find a virus from nature that, when they exposed it to human cells, appeared to cause some kind of bad reaction, a negative impact. So that was the nature of that work that Strecker was communicating to these people in the early 80s, when Dr. Livingston and Dr. Cantwell sat there one night at her house and listened to him for about 3 hours talk about, this is what I think is happening with HIV. Now, this preceded the formal announcement in 1988 that HIV-1, we know the direct genetic predecessor was the chimpanzee SIV. That was a really important link. That happened after Strecker made a video about his hypotheses, and his brother circulated a mailer to a number of people, which is likely what got him killed that same year in 1988. But that's the nature of the material that they talked about. And Alan came to that and was fascinated, and as someone who was dealing with AIDS patients on a daily basis, it was quite important to him to get to the bottom of this, but he didn't believe it. And he started pulling up the references, and he came to the truth.
I just was looking for Dr. Robert Strecker and found a copy of, let's see what this says. It says, "Is AIDS man-made? The Strecker Memorandum." And it looks pretty interesting. I'll put it up here just for oops, it's hard for me to do that. Very interesting. Is AIDS man-made? And the Strecker Memorandum. Let's see if I can read any of it. Well, here's some points here. I'll just read through. AIDS is a man-made disease. AIDS is not a homosexual disease. AIDS is not a venereal disease. AIDS can be carried by mosquitoes. Condoms will not prevent AIDS. There are at least 6 different AIDS viruses loose in the world, and so on and so on. Well, maybe that was an unfair thing to do, to just grab a little bit out of there, but here's, and I can't see a date on it either, but this must be in the 80s. So the idea that it's man-made then leads to the idea that it's obviously some type of a secret operation or military program that, yeah, intended to kill, but you say Dr. Cantwell didn't go there.
Dr. Cantwell, I appreciate his healthy skepticism. I don't know if Dr. Strecker had that piece published when he met Dr. Livingston and Dr. Cantwell and their colleagues that night. I think it was 1985. I want to say there's so many bits and pieces. And then when go back and read someone else's book that has done an encyclopedic job with a timeline, and they've just got a million factoids that are all pinpointed to different time. It all starts blurring, but I believe that conversation happened over dinner, after dinner, in Dr. Livingston's house in 1985. But so his Strecker Memorandum is a video. And I'll follow up to this show. I'll go over and respond to the Rumble and put a link, because I've got his memorandum video posted over on We Talk, You Listen. So you can hear for yourself what a sober fellow Dr. Strecker was. Dr. Strecker died in a car accident in 2018. He was on his way from Las Vegas back to Needles, California, which is right next to the Nevada border. He had a gastroenterology, GI practice, and he was just about to retire. But anyhow, this film that you'll be able to see if you want is basically 2 pieces. Remember, again, he did this before they had the genetic data from Los Alamos about the chimpanzee connection. I'm certain he adjusted his hypotheses as time went by. But at the time he filmed this, he really emphasizes some of the genetics that they found. And part of that was interesting, and that's a real mystery, that there's another part of a virus found in HIV-1 called Visna. And Visna is a sheep virus. And I've found papers where they're looking to fuse simian type C viruses with Visna. That would have been one of the steps to get SIV CPZ into HIV-1. So his genetic aim isn't completely off, but he's quite fascinated by bovine viruses and wasting disorders, which he was observing in these cases. So that's where his speech is scientifically off the mark. But you can see for yourself the kinds of material that he pulls up. And then the second part of it is he's got a panel of, in my opinion, quite sober judges. They ask some very pointed questions, and he takes Q&A for about half of the time. So you can see where all of this thought, this school of thought about HIV as a bio warfare tool really began in the public domain. And there were people who inspired Robert. I don't know who his informants were, and I never had the pleasure of actually meeting him. I had a little bit of a feeling in my gut that was a call that I shouldn't make, that was someone that I just shouldn't get into contact with. And I don't know if that was a mistake, John, or not, but he left behind this piece of work. There's also his brother's mailer, which I've got as a PDF, and I share that. That's part of my collection. And other people have, posted Teddy Strecker's mailer. It was the Biowarfare Attack, I think is what Teddy's mailer was titled. And a number of other pieces of material that, including in Dr. Horowitz's book, Emerging Viruses, AIDS and Ebola, there's a chapter which is their telephone interview. And that's an opportunity by the mid 90s for Dr. Strecker to reflect back on the updates in what happened with the genetics, finding out about the chimpanzee, excuse me, and a number of other topics that occurred in HIV that they have a chance to sort of update and tune up. That's a really important piece of Leonard's writing that I would encourage people. That's, for me, after that, I didn't see much come from Dr. Strecker. He just ran his practice in Needles. He was, as I said, he was going to retire very soon. And he had property. I don't know if he owned it or was preparing to purchase on Big Island and move over to Hawaii and, really put a pin in it when he died in that accident. So that's a little bit more about Mr. Strecker.
Another book by Dr. Alan Cantwell is called AIDS and the Doctors of Death, an inquiry into the origin of the AIDS epidemic. What would we learn if we decided to buy and pick and purchase and read that book? Do you consider that to be part of the literature that we should have under our belts, and why?
I would say that that was his first. We'll say first attempt at getting the word out.
Okay.
And he was saying, he'll tell you can listen to him in his own words, talk about his skepticism about hearing Strecker's message, his path of, being a true bench scientist and a practicing clinician, a part-time oncology researcher. We'll say researcher because he wasn't an oncologist. That's a whole nother degree. Specialty, but he, as I said, his dealings on a day-to-day basis were at the microscopic level with the pathologist. It wasn't, skinned knees and oh, I've got this little rash. I need some cortisone. It was really about doing the microbiology work of dermatology. So you'll see him talking about his basis for why am I, why do I feel qualified to opine about this at all? And then he'll discuss, his beginnings of verifying things and checking the math and pulling the papers. And having some jaw-dropping moments of just sort of unbelievable guffaw. The next book that he published was a few years later, about 5 years later, and that's Queer Blood, The Secret AIDS Genocide Plot with a big pink triangle. For those of you that don't know, the pink triangle came from the Nazis. It was one of the sorting houses, if we can borrow that from Hogwarts. You would be sorted into, are you a gypsy? Are you a Jew? Are you a homosexual? And the homosexuals would have the pink triangle on their insignia before they were killed or experimented on. And that's where, the symbol was taken from the US gay community. They decided to adopt that. Alan uses it on the cover of his book, and it looks very hyperbolic. I think, I scolded him about his branding when I met him, just gently, but I said, look, if you'd taken a little more scholarly or academic approach to branding your work, it's not what you wrote inside, it's what you decided to call it. Now you decided to, how you wanted it to impact people. And he laughed. We had a good laugh about it. I said, you're a scientist. Yes, there it is. I said, but you made a book that looks like like a poster you'd see the ACT UP folks do at a die-in in the streets of New York. It's pretty out there. And he's like, I know, but I needed to grab people. I said, yeah, but Alan, you're the scientist. You're the rational one. So we had a good laugh about that.
Well, is the contents of it though? I mean, is it still, or is it outdated?
It's not outdated at all because by the point he writes Queer Blood, he's not retelling what he told in the first book. It's a very, very skinny book. I've got it in my hands right here. It's 130 pages before you hit the references. So in big, nice, big print, he's got 14-point font here. So Alan tells this from the point of a person who happens to be a scientist, and he asks the questions and then takes you through how he approaches his method of verifying, dispelling, or confirming something. And he has to leave a lot of things open-ended, but it's definitely not a rehash of the first work. I don't know who gets the money now since it's still for sale up there. I hope his husband gets it. His husband's name is Frank Sinatra. And yes, he's the nephew of the Frank Sinatra. And they were married in Hollywood and had a beautiful little, one story in the Hollywood Hills under the sign. That's where I met Alan, and I got to meet Frank too. So I don't know if the family gets the proceeds. It's not a lot, but they're worth getting if you care about, okay, now that I know that this guy was a dermatologist, a cancer researcher, he did work well beyond HIV. Really, he wanted to be considered as a cancer investigator. He might be worth taking it. Take the time and listen to him. Well, if you don't want to spend the money, listen to him and Leonard talk about their experiences, because he summarizes a lot of the points that he makes in the books. And if you want to know more, then get the books. But like I said, they're worthwhile in that they're the author's own experience. It's like buying a Mark Twain piece, and as he describes history, as he talks about those experiences firsthand, if that's important to you, you're going to recognize some things that are occurring today. Very, very legitimate scientists getting kicked off of social media platforms because they're asking difficult questions.
Yeah.
Very important papers and clinical data being questioned or just ignored because it's inconvenient to the pharmaceutical paradigm. Those are the kinds of things that you'll see Alan talking about and might have some more meaning.
Also, I just noticed from a brief review of the blurb under the book at Amazon that part of the book discusses the theory that this was a weapon aimed at gays and blacks. And that comes, I guess, from the observations of Alan Cantwell. And other people have suggested that as well. Is Dr. Cantwell now kind of a revered figure in the gay community, or what does his legacy look like?
His legacy is, for the most part, who is that? Alan who?
Yeah,
Because the kids don't, I mean, they will watch documentaries about Stonewall. Right now, between now, I mean, this is Pride season. So you're going to see on Netflix, there's a wave of Pride stuff that goes back to the American Crucible, which were the riots at Stonewall, when the drag queens got tired of cops coming in and clubbing them in the head and pulling them out and putting them in the newspaper and trying to ruin their lives, and they got uppity, right? That's what the kids look at. Alan was relegated to, really, there are elderly. There are the revered, the wizened, circle of senior scientist investigators, many of whom are coming back and taking a second look at Cantwell and Horowitz and Strecker. But in the community, most people had the same reaction that I did when they first saw Alan's work, and they never bothered to try and reconcile it. They weren't going to do an actuarial accounting, John. They
yeah.
were offended. It was a nightmare that they were seeing coming out of this man's, writing. And they're like, I can't accept that for a moment, because it's already too much to cope with the death and the disease and the horrors that I'm dealing with on a day-to-day basis. here in my community. I don't need some doctor telling me that the government did this to us. That's about as far as most people went with him. And that's what breaks my heart. But at the same time, I know what they paid. I know the costs of what they have experienced. And many of them paid a whole lot more than I did. So, I'm not gonna. It's a strange discontent that I have to make peace with. Um, I keep inviting the Advocate and all of the gay newspapers and any of the gay national press that have persisted over the years since the 70s to please come and sit down. And I won't just talk. I'll do nothing but show you the scientific evidence. You'll fall out of your chair. You'll lose your mind. You'll hate me. You'll need a drink. You'll need a bottle of booze, but you'll get your own access to the evidence, and no one will ever be able to take it away. I'll give you the evidence. There's nothing to buy. I can never get them to engage. They will not even approach this hypothesis. And that's,
The
it's tough.
hypothesis
It's
being what?
exactly what Strecker and Cantwell discussed and verified, that this microbe, which originally was a contaminant and a known veterinary and zoonotic problem, as we see in the literature going well before AIDS emerged, from chimpanzees, was discovered to be one of the candidate viruses that could cause disease in other animals. And eventually it was humanized, and then it was deployed. And it was deployed through a vaccine vector in Africa. It's believed that those vectors occurred in USAID and World Health Organization vaccine campaigns that included smallpox and hepatitis B. And in the US, there was a large national campaign run by the NIAID, Tony Fauci's organization, which began in New York City, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. And that there was a deliberate contamination of those vectors to depopulate the target populations. That's the hypothesis.
So essentially, what he was saying back in the 1980s is still a not only a viable but an hypothesis that you sign on to. And I think for the rest of us to try to sort out what's going on with our public health, the World Health Organization, and all of the things we hear concerning the so-called pandemic. There has to be a logical answer. And to go back to somebody who was there at the beginning that did, the KS, that did as a dermatologist, of course, that's his field. And that hadn't dawned on me until we had this talk tonight, that's why he would have been the appropriate person, because the complaints are skin diseases. And of course, that's why he would have been exposed to so many of the early cases and be able to come up with the thoughts that have led to led to people like yourself who are now helping the rest of us understand this, as you say, very, very complex disease of cancer, and a very, very complex situation with regard to the powers behind the scenes, to try to understand and try to take that situation you described so well about the young people who, confronted with the allegations that you just made, will just say, no, that's too much. I can't handle it. That's the same thing that happens to people. It's happened to people in the past 3 years when I try to talk to them about COVID, and they cannot. No, it's just not going to get through their defense system, and that's a part of the problem with humanity is there's only so much we can take. We don't want to have to process things that are terribly, terribly evil, and so we tend to push them aside. But the damage has been done in many, many ways to people and their families over the past 40 years now, and we've got to get to the bottom of it. And we got to get past it. And you've spent a good part of your life helping to do this research, Nick. So thank you for your work, and thanks for helping introduce Dr. Cantwell to our subscribers and our audience. And Hope people enjoy this and get something out of it. Pass it on to others, and start thinking seriously about how we can open people's minds. We have to open them. And you've been working on this longer than I have, but it's the same problem. People don't want to hear things that are utterly disturbing to their sense of comfort in life. It's very uncomfortable to think about somebody as evil as someone that would create, a bioweapon that could wipe out a certain part of humanity. So, wow. Well, Nick, it's hours flown by as it usually does. Thanks for being with me once again, and for all your good work. Anything else you'd like to add tonight?
No, I'd just like to thank you for, again, continuing our conversation and going back to these areas, and particularly when we spend a moment talking about Dr. Cantwell, it can't do justice to the effort and the very, very selfless and lonely path that whistleblowers walk. He's not the only whistleblower. There's lots of folks that have tried to bring forward truth. So that's something that I keep in mind. I sure appreciate and respect your work and your investigations. And everyone, thank you again for joining us tonight.
Yep, we're going to figure it out. All right. Thanks again, everybody. I will post that interview with Dr. Cantwell and Lynn Horowitz in the show notes on both channels, on the YouTube and also on the Rumble channel. All right, guys. Thanks a lot. I'll see you tomorrow for open chat at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. So join me then.